This is a video about Bertrand Bickersteth's essay An Alberta Rose for Black Canada, and I'll talk about this in terms of writing a summary for the course. And I'll talk about two things. One, I'll talk about just getting a general understanding of the text through some of the details, and then I'll talk about the larger structures or segments, sections of the text. So there's not a single right way to think about or to write a summary or to read a text, and you have to start with what makes sense to you. So what I offer here is just a way into the text, okay? And it's not necessarily the kind of stuff you'd include in the summary anyways, but it's a demonstration of how you can think about some of the details of the text in order to understand the text more thoroughly. So remember that writing a summary is more than just getting the gist of a text, broad overview, general, okay? But it's about thorough understanding. So for example, we could look at the title. The title is An Alberta Rose for Black Canada. Now, the Alberta wild rose is a common symbol in our province. It's on our license plates, on our cars. We used to have a political party called the Wild Rose Party, okay? But of course, that's not exactly what Bickersteth is talking about here. Rather, as we learn, we don't know this until we read and reflect on the text. So maybe you noticed this when you read it. Oh, Alberta, wild rose. Oh, okay, yeah, Alberta roses. Or maybe you didn't. It's just like right over your head, okay? But when we stop, we're like, okay, Alberta and roses are connected. Okay? But what we realize when we reflect on the text is that Alberta and Rose are the names of the two women in August Wilson's play Fences that Bickersteth is talking about. Coincidence? I think not. Right? He probably chose this play to talk about precisely because it talks about Alberta and Rose, and wouldn't it be interesting to write an essay about this? Is that his main focus? No. Is it an interesting detail? I think so. Okay? And it's just a nice way to say, oh, what seems completely disconnected, some African-American playwright talking about Pittsburgh, actually has a relationship to what's happening in Alberta for Bertrand Bickersteth. Okay, so the same words, the same symbols mean different things in different contexts. Okay, in the play, Alberta and Rose are women. For Bickersteth, Alberta Rose is a symbol of the province. Okay, yet we have to be careful because he never explicitly makes this connection. I'm just making it here to try and help you to understand the text. So in writing a summary, don't mention the Alberta Wild Rose Party. Don't mention license plates. That's not in the text. That's just me trying to help you say, oh yeah, there's some connections that we should think about in the background. Okay. There are ways you might broach this by saying, he implies a connection, but again, we want to focus on the major things, not implied things. But my point, again, is that you should work through the text slowly and think about these connections. It can only help you understand it better. So to take a different approach, the second part that I want to look at is we want to look at the major chunks of the essay, okay? And we can break it down into paragraphs. Now, in your summary, you're not going to say in paragraph 1 he says this, in paragraph 2 he says this, in paragraph 3. That's a list. That's not a summary, okay? Sometimes paragraphs are really important. Other times they're not as important. So we don't want to just itemize the list. So that's not what we want to do, okay? But if we break it into chunks, we could look at the opening 2 paragraphs, okay? The opening paragraph begins with a discussion of August Wilson, who's an American playwright. Yet Bickersteth is a Canadian poet. They are different, aside from both being writers and both being black. But if you pay attention, you'll find that Bickersteth talks in terms of large and small. For example, he talks about, quote, the grandness of this work, Wilson's work, which speaks to the large. Yet he immediately says this is grounded in the intimate concern of African American life, which speaks to the small, the intimate details. Okay? In the very same sentence, he writes about African American life, big stuff, but in the very local community of Pittsburgh that Wilson lives in, the small. Okay? In the next paragraph, he continues with Black life as the fabric of America itself. But this is achieved through a small community. So again, the large and the small. So we can start to understand how Bickersteth uses examples, the small, to generalize about something larger, the big, right? The local details may be different, but he's constructing a way to talk about blackness from his own position as an Albertan, not as African American, but as African Canadian or African Albertan, that there are some similarities and the differences. So his differences from Wilson, the small details, do not deny him from understanding that they share similar larger concerns about things like blackness, about race and racism, okay, about inclusion and what it means to be part of a community. Okay? So to take a different example, he points out genre, or the kind of writing that he does. He acknowledges that Wilson writes plays, while he, Bickersteth, largely writes poems. They write different kinds of writing, but their writing is, both of them, concerned about race and blackness. So these first two paragraphs establish this relationship between the large and the small, okay, between the detail and the bigger idea, and they establish the topic about writing and blackness. Okay? But this is all just stuff. These are topics, subjects. These are not a thesis. It's not an argument yet. Okay? So this is what I mean about working through the text slowly to identify the major topics or subjects and then trying to figure out the thesis. So then we can look at other larger chunks of the essay. So in paragraphs 3 to 5, he discusses his experiences of growing up in Alberta. He talks about playing hockey, for example. But in paragraphs 6 to 10, he talks about leaving Alberta and living elsewhere in the world. Then in paragraphs 11 to 13, he returns to Wilson and his plays, talking about how his own understanding of Wilson and his own life has changed. Okay? And so you can go back and reread those sections of the text as discrete chunks to say, okay, here's an idea, here's another big idea, here's another big idea. How do I work those into my summary? Of course, there's other things you need to think about as well. In the final paragraph, he says, we are the responsible parent and the innocent child at once. Notice how this ties in with the theme of being half throughout the text. And we can think of this half in different ways. Okay? We can think of half as being separate, as in not full. Okay? I have half a glass of water or half a piece of toast. It's not full. So Bickersteth says at various times that he feels like he's not a real Canadian or a real Albertan. He's excluded somehow. He doesn't have full citizenship. He's not a full person, precisely because he's black. That sense of being half is a sense of lacking. Yet there's another sense that he talks about in terms of being a halfling, where he talks about being two things, being made up of two halves. Okay? He is black and Albertan. Okay? He's a whole person that's come to understand himself as being made up of multiple things. Two halves, 6 parts, 8 parts, doesn't matter, right? But rather than feeling like you're only half a person, you can feel like a halfling to say, I'm not that version of personhood, but I'm a different version of personhood. I'm made up of different things, 2 halves, 3/3, whatever. Okay? So what was denied to him before, for example, oil rigs, he's like, I never fit in with that oil rig culture because they were white culture. He's now reclaimed as his, as something that he can own and actually make a part of him, albeit not in the same way as they are for white people. Okay? So what was denied to him before, oil rigs, hockey, or whatever, he now comes to a different understanding of what that is and reincorporates it into his sense of identity or personhood. And so we see this earlier. Okay? He has to leave to Alberta. He goes to Vancouver, he goes to England, he goes to Ireland. Okay? He talks about the Caribbean, he talks about Nigeria, in order to understand that he does, in fact, belong in Alberta. So notice how this sense of lack, not being an Albertan, when he leaves, he gets some perspective and he realizes that, oh, maybe I do belong in Alberta. I just never saw it that way before. So it was originally a sense of lack and a lack of belonging. By leaving, he understands that sense of belonging. He changes his understanding of what it means to be black and Albertan in order to find a place to belong. Okay? And so he changes or transforms that into a sense of ownership, a sense of identity, a sense of hybridity, and a sense of belonging on new terms. So you can see that there's a lot happening in this text, and your job is to find the right balance of talking about these details as you summarize the text.